At the tail end of a punishing schedule, famed actor Samuel L. Jackson yearns for a quiet moment in a humble Los Angeles diner. Yet a single heated exchange shatters the calm. A broad-shouldered man corners a trembling teen over protection money. Even as the aroma of black coffee and sizzling bacon lingers in the air, Samuel's instincts kick in. This isn't a film set or a rehearsed scene. It's a brutal reality that demands immediate action. In that tense confrontation, an everyday act of heroism pulls Samuel into a hidden world of extortion and fear lurking beneath the city's polished veneer. Joined by a determined lawyer, a weary community center director, and a steadfast detective, he soon realizes that saving one kid from a bullying crook is only the beginning. The ring extends far deeper, its shadowy tendrils touching vulnerable families across multiple neighborhoods. When threats escalate, and every step stirs danger, Samuel must choose between returning to Hollywood's spotlight or standing shoulder to shoulder with those who have no choice but to fight back. In a city notorious for illusions, can one man's genuine voice rally a community desperate for justice? Time is ticking, and hope hinges on his resolve. The morning air in Los Angeles carried with it a warmth that promised a hot afternoon, but for now, it felt gentle against Samuel L. Jackson's face. He stepped out of his house with a sigh of relief. He had been juggling back-to-back film commitments, press junkets, and interviews for months, and this was one of those exceedingly rare days when his morning was mercifully free. No alarm clocks, no urgent calls from directors, and no frantic text messages from publicists. Just a few hours he could steal for himself. Dressed in casual slacks, a loose-fitting shirt, and a light jacket, Samuel slid behind the wheel of his inconspicuous SUV, a vehicle far removed from the flashy sports cars often associated with celebrities. He preferred this quiet approach, especially on days when he craved anonymity. The city's early traffic was already building, but he navigated toward Hollywood with practiced ease. As he drove, he flipped on the radio, catching snippets of news about a recent neighborhood cleanup initiative. The announcer's optimistic tone lightened his mood. Sometimes, even LA needs a hero to tackle day-to-day problems, Samuel mused. He didn't have a specific destination in mind, only the intention to find a cozy spot for brunch where he could read the newspaper and relax. After a few more turns through side streets, he spotted a small neon sign flickering in the distance, Gracie's Diner. It was the kind of place that looked like it had existed for decades. The paint on the sign slightly chipped, the windows adorned with red and white checkered curtains. The name was familiar. He recalled someone on set mentioning a hidden gem diner with amazing pies. He parked along the curb and glanced around, noting the lack of paparazzi or bustling crowds. Perfect. Satisfied with his stroke of luck, Samuel locked the SUV and strolled across the sidewalk, letting the city's morning rhythm guide him. A bell over the door jingled as he entered the diner, revealing a modest interior with red vinyl booths, a long counter lined with swivel stools, and a few framed pictures of old Hollywood landmarks on the walls. The aroma of coffee, bacon, and toasted bread filled the air. It reminded him of simpler times, before the fame, the iconic roles, and the relentless spotlight. A friendly waitress with short, curly hair greeted him. "Morning! Just one today?" she asked. Her name tag read Caroline. She appeared a little awestruck, recognition flickered in her eyes, but she kept it professional, a courtesy Samuel appreciated. "Morning," Samuel replied with a polite smile. "Yes, a booth if you have one." She guided him to a booth by the window, slightly tucked away, respecting his obvious desire for some privacy. When she handed him a menu, he returned her courtesy with a quiet word of thanks. He was relieved to see that no one else in the diner was pointing or whispering at him. It wasn't that he disliked fans, but occasionally, he needed these small oases of normalcy. Opening the menu, he noted the usual diner classics: pancakes, omelets, burgers, and a dozen variations of sandwiches. The daily special was a sunrise special: eggs, bacon, and a short stack of pancakes. Simple enough, he thought. Before Caroline returned, he pulled out a neatly folded newspaper he had tucked inside his jacket. Flipping to the local section, he read about a community outreach program aimed at reducing petty crime among teenagers. That kind of news always caught his eye, reminding him of his own youth in Chattanooga, Tennessee, reminding him of how easy it was for a young person to slip down the wrong path when resources were scarce. A few minutes later, Caroline approached again to take his order. "The sunrise special and a cup of black coffee," he said. She jotted it down, gave a small nod, and headed off to the kitchen. Samuel settled back into the booth, letting himself enjoy the muffled hum of conversation, the clang of dishes being rinsed, and the sizzle of food on the grill. This was real life, unfiltered, much different from film sets or the glamour of Hollywood events. He was halfway through an article on local civic improvements when raised voices drew his attention to the front counter. Two figures stood there. One was a lanky teenage boy, probably no older than 14 or 15, wearing a faded hoodie and scuffed sneakers. The other, looming over him, was a broad-shouldered man in a cheap-looking suit. The tension in their posture was undeniable. The diner's background chatter seemed to subside, as if the other patrons were collectively holding their breath. "Where is it? I told you I want my money now," the man demanded, gripping the boy's backpack strap. His voice was low and menacing, each word sharpened by anger. I don't have it," the boy stammered, eyes wide and darting around, as if seeking an escape route. His shoulders slumped under the weight of fear. Samuel felt his own pulse pick up. It was an eerily familiar tableau. He'd seen plenty of intimidation scenes in his youth, not to mention in scripts he'd read. But this was happening right in front of him, not in a movie or a controlled environment. Glancing around, he noticed other diners looking uneasy, but no one seemed ready to intervene. The man in the suit pressed closer, breathing heavily. "Don't lie to me. You took something that belongs to me, and now you're trying to run." "I didn't. I swear," the teenager mumbled, his voice scarcely above a whisper. He tried to pull away, but the man wouldn't let go. In that instant, Samuel set his newspaper aside. His heart rate quickened. This wasn't a rehearsed scene with stunned men. He had no guarantee of how the aggressor might react if confronted. Yet he also knew he couldn't just sit there and watch a kid be terrorized. Years of portraying strong, fearless characters had taught him something. Genuine courage meant stepping up when it mattered in real life, not just in front of a camera. Without hesitating, Samuel slid out of the booth. He walked towards the man, each step measured but resolute. Every patron's gaze locked onto him. Perhaps they recognized who he was, perhaps they were just relieved someone was doing something. "Excuse me," Samuel said in a calm but firm voice. He placed a steady hand on the man's shoulder. His years of film set fight training didn't hurt either. "Is there a problem here?" The man wheeled around, eyes flashing. Upon recognizing the face of the individual confronting him, confusion flickered across his features. Then anger returned to fill the gap. "Back off," he snapped, though his voice trembled slightly. "This kid owes me." Samuel kept his hand where it was, posture balanced. "The way you're talking, it sounds like you're about to hurt him," he said. "And that's not going to happen." A hush fell over the diner. Caroline, the waitress, hovered near the phone. Another waiter appeared from the kitchen, spatula in hand, unsure whether to intervene. The teenage boy clutched his backpack with trembling fingers, as though it were a shield. "This doesn't concern you," the man insisted, attempting to pull away from Samuel's grasp. But Samuel L. Jackson did not let go. Something in his voice, in his presence, stopped the man cold. "You're in a public place, harassing a minor. That makes it everyone's concern." Then he glanced at Caroline, gave a small nod, and said firmly, "Call the police." Realizing the situation was rapidly turning against him, the man tried to yank free and bolt for the door. Before he could make a clean escape, Samuel positioned himself squarely between the man and the exit. All those years of playing action roles had honed his reflexes more than he liked to admit. "You're not going anywhere until the authorities show up," Samuel said, keeping his voice low and controlled. The teenage boy, stunned, took a few steps back, as if still processing the fact that someone had come to his rescue. In the distance, Caroline's voice could be heard giving details to a 911 operator. The man's face twisted in rage, but he also seemed frightened now, caught in the act, outnumbered by the onlookers willing to support the truth. He glared at Samuel for a long, tense moment, but found no weakness to exploit. Within minutes, the wail of sirens pierced the morning air. Red and blue lights reflected through the diner's windows. 2 LAPD officers burst in, hands hovering near their holsters. They assessed the scene, Samuel calmly restraining the aggressor, the visibly shaken teenager, and a handful of startled patrons. The next few moments were a blur of words. Assault, harassment, and extortion were tossed around. Statements were taken. Witnesses spoke up, emboldened by Samuel's intervention. The officers cuffed the man and guided him out, ignoring his curses and half-hearted protests. Amid the fading commotion, Samuel gently placed a hand on the teenager's shoulder. "Hey," he said, voice warm with concern. "Are you okay?" The boy, eyes still brimming with fear, nodded shakily. "Thanks, mister," he managed. As the diner's clamor returned to a semblance of normalcy, the waitress Caroline approached, visibly relieved. She placed a comforting hand on the boy's back. "Kid, you need anything? Water? A place to sit?" The boy just shook his head, clutching his backpack like it was the most precious thing in the world. Samuel could see how badly the teen's hands trembled. The entire incident lasted only minutes, but to the boy, it must have felt like an eternity. In the aftermath, as tension dissipated and patrons breathed easier, Samuel glanced at his half-finished coffee back at the booth. The mug had gone cold, neglected amid the chaos. Yet a sense of resolve settled over him. This had been more than an ordinary lunch. He had stepped in during someone's moment of need, and that singular act was about to cast ripples far beyond these diner walls. The front door of Gracie's diner slammed shut behind the man in the cheap suit, only to have him yank it open again when he realized he couldn't leave without passing by Samuel L. Jackson. For a fleeting instant, he hovered by the threshold, staring daggers at the people inside. His nostrils flared in anger, and his eyes darted around the room, as though calculating his next move. Everyone felt the tension crackle through the air, a silent current electrifying the cozy diner. It had been mere seconds since Samuel calmly told the waitress, Caroline, to call the police. The teenage boy in the faded hoodie, his name still unknown to Samuel, stood like a statue, clutching his backpack as though it were a protective shield. His gaze flicked anxiously between the man and the diner's exit, uncertain whether to flee or stay. Every patron in the room felt the same uncertainty. Half of them looked poised to bolt, the other half rooted to the spot by a mix of fear and concern. Caroline gripped the phone behind the counter, her voice echoing across the suddenly quiet space. "Yes, there's a situation at Gracie's Diner on Sunset. A man is harassing a minor. Please send someone quickly." Her calm, measured tone belied the tension roiling in her eyes. Though the diner's decor was simple, plastic flower arrangements on each table, red vinyl booths, and scuffed black and white linoleum floors, the atmosphere felt anything but ordinary now. The comforting hiss of the grill had fallen silent, the cook peeking out warily from behind the pass-through window. A half-eaten plate of pancakes lay abandoned on a table near the window, the diner's only nod to normalcy amidst the simmering standoff. The man in the cheap suit clenched his fists, glaring at Samuel with unmistakable hostility. "So you think you're a hero now, Jackson?" His voice carried a sneer, but also the slightest quiver. Samuel held his ground. Though the years had taught him how to remain poised under pressure, he could still feel a spike of adrenaline. Reality was far different from an orchestrated movie set. No stunt coordinators, no second takes. Just real consequences. He shifted his weight, keeping one eye on the man's movements and the other on the trembling teenager. "You're the one making this situation worse," Samuel said evenly, his basso profundo voice rumbling through the hush. "Let the kid go. You've done enough." The man's brow glistened with sweat as he jabbed a thumb toward the teenager. "He stole from me. You get that? Stole. I just want what's mine." The boy opened his mouth as if to protest, but no words came out. He looked paralyzed, pinned by the gaze of the man who'd been tormenting him. At that moment, a few other patrons decided they'd had enough. An older woman, dressed in a floral blouse and carrying a small handbag, stood from her booth in a corner. She clutched her purse with trembling hands, cleared her throat, and addressed the man. "You need to calm down, sir. You're scaring us." Though her voice wavered, there was a surprising firmness underneath. The man let out a bitter laugh. "You people want me to calm down? Maybe you should mind your own business." That statement only emphasized how very wrong the man was about the situation. Harassing a minor in a public place didn't allow for privacy. It was everyone's business, just as Samuel had said minutes earlier. The hush deepened. Time seemed to slow, and the smell of cooling bacon and coffee no longer offered comfort. Then came a new jolt, the blare of distant sirens, faint but unmistakable. Relief coursed through some of the onlookers, as though that sound signaled an end to the tension. Yet, it also spurred the man in the suit into action. His eyes flicked to the teenage boy again, a strange mix of rage and desperation in that stare. "You called them!" The man snapped at Caroline, though it was clear to everyone that it had been Samuel's prompt. Caroline stood with the phone still pressed against her ear, verifying details for the dispatcher. She refused to let his aggression faze her. "Police will be here any minute," she said, leveling a resolute look his way. "You should just step away from the boy." For a second, it seemed like the man might comply. The sirens were definitely growing louder, and his bravado was wavering. But as if spurred by a last burst of defiance, he lunged in the teenager's direction. Quick as a flash, Samuel shifted to block him, one arm outstretched, the other ready to defend. In the startled hush, an overturned salt shaker skittered across the floor, a silent witness to the sudden scuffle. "Move, Jackson!" the man snarled, trying to shove past. Samuel planted his feet. He was no trained martial artist, but decades of fight choreography, plus real-life experiences growing up around rough neighborhoods, had granted him formidable instincts. His stance was steady, arms poised, ensuring the man couldn't simply brush him aside. "I told you, not happening," he said, his voice low, measured, the tone that had stolen so many scenes on screen. The man was bigger, but fueled by adrenaline, Samuel managed to hold him at bay for a few critical seconds. Those seconds allowed the teenage boy to scramble behind the counter, where Caroline stood guard, phone still in hand. The boy crouched there, panting, eyes wide, as if he couldn't believe any of this was real. A moment later, the diner door flew open with enough force to rattle the glass. 2 police officers, faces taut with urgency, stepped inside. One was a tall, lean officer with Lopez on his nameplate, the other, a broad-shouldered older cop named Sanders. Their presence altered the atmosphere instantly, like a storm cloud breaking in the sky, offering both foreboding and a promise of resolution. Lopez directed his gaze at the scene. A furious man in a suit squared off against the unflinching figure of Samuel L. Jackson. Realization dawned, and he shot a quick glance at Sanders. They recognized the celebrity, but they also recognized the gravity of the situation. "Hands where we can see them!" Lopez barked, drawing attention away from Samuel and onto the aggressor. The man paused, fist still clenched, but he lifted both hands slowly. Samuel used the break in tension to take a single step back, letting the officers establish control. He exhaled the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Meanwhile, Caroline beckoned the teenage boy to stay behind the counter, out of harm's way. Officer Sanders stepped forward, posture rigid, his voice firm. "What's going on here?" Instantly, 3 or 4 patrons started talking at once. The older woman in the floral blouse, Caroline, a man at a nearby table who'd witnessed everything, and even the teenage boy, though his voice was barely above a whisper. Through the chaotic flood of explanations, the officers pieced together that the man in the suit had threatened the boy, possibly over extortion or an unpaid debt. "You have any idea who you're messing with?" the man hissed at Samuel, as though his arrests and charges could be undone by intimidation. Samuel didn't dignify it with a response. He merely raised an eyebrow, an expression that, on film, had cut villains down to size countless times. In real life, it was just as potent. Within minutes, the officers maneuvered the man away from the counter. After patting him down, they placed him in handcuffs with practiced efficiency. As he was escorted out, the man spat more threats, too incoherent to be taken seriously, though the undercurrent of menace still made the boy flinch. A collective sigh of relief seemed to ripple through the diner. The overhead lights, once feeling harsh and oppressive, now seemed normal again. Officer Lopez turned to the teenage boy. "Are you hurt?" He crouched down to meet the teen's eyes. The boy gulped, then shook his head. "I'm fine," he said, voice catching on the last syllable. His trembling hands betrayed him, though, and every adult present could see that fine was a fragile word at best. Officer Sanders nodded, taking a quick statement from Caroline. Then, noticing Samuel's measured calm, he stepped over. "Mr. Jackson," he said respectfully, "I appreciate your help. We'll need a brief statement before we go." "Of course," Samuel replied. He offered the boy a reassuring nod. "You okay there?" he asked again. The boy nodded more firmly this time, though his breath still came in shallow bursts. Caroline wrapped an arm around the teenager's shoulders, guiding him toward a booth to sit down. Patrons began to talk in hushed relief, turning their attention back to half-finished meals and coffee cups that had grown cold during the confrontation. Some recognized the famous actor, but in that moment, Samuel was less a movie star and more a protective force, one who had stepped up because it was simply the right thing to do. Outside, the piercing wail of sirens faded as the squad cars prepared to transport the cuffed man. Inside, Gracie's diner slowly exhaled the tension, returning to its unassuming normalcy. Yet the aftermath lingered in the trembling boy's eyes, the scattered salt on the floor, and the swirl of questions forming in everyone's mind. Why had the man targeted the kid? Was there more to this story than just one ugly altercation? As Samuel looked around, he realized that sometimes, one decisive moment of intervention brought with it consequences bigger than he could anticipate. This wasn't a movie set. There wouldn't be an easy wrap-up or a neatly packaged ending. Tension in the diner had been resolved, for now, but the ripples of that moment would carry on long after the last officer left. And although he didn't know it yet, Samuel was already stepping onto a path that would change more than just one teenager's life. The sirens grew louder and nearer, echoing along Sunset Boulevard before culminating in a vivid swirl of red and blue lights outside Gracie's diner. Patrons stared as two Los Angeles Police Department squad cars screeched to a halt near the curb, the officers inside quickly disembarking. The tension that had engulfed the diner moments earlier did not subside at their arrival. If anything, it heightened, as though everyone understood that the most dangerous moments often came right before control was re-established. The man in the cheap suit, eyes still wild, made a quick motion, as if debating whether to break for the exit. But the door was now blocked by a tall, lean officer, nameplate gleaming with Lopez, who had one hand resting on his holster. Standing behind him was a heavier-set, older cop with graying temples, Sanders, whose calm but watchful gaze surveyed the entire diner. Inside, the patrons were frozen in a mixture of relief and nervous anticipation. At the counter, the teenage boy hugged his backpack so tightly that the straps dug into his shoulders, though he seemed momentarily buoyed by the sight of the police. Leaning halfway over the counter, still holding the phone receiver with trembling fingers, was Caroline, the waitress who had called 911 at Samuel's request. Her eyes flicked from the arriving officers to the shaken teenager, and then finally to the man who had threatened him. Nearby, Samuel L. Jackson stood ready, his posture balanced between confrontation and caution. His heartbeat hammered against his ribs, but outwardly he remained a picture of composure, a skill honed over decades of acting and real-life experience. He cut a striking figure, the iconic face so many recognize from films, now set in a serious, protective expression. He had done what he could to keep the man at bay, but the situation felt as though it teetered on a razor's edge. "Don't move," Officer Lopez said, stepping deeper into the diner. His tone carried the no-nonsense authority of someone used to encountering danger, but it also had a tinge of uncertainty. He recognized the famous actor inside, yet he didn't know the full story. The man in the suit slowly raised his hands, but the defiance in his eyes remained. "This is all a misunderstanding," he growled, though the sweat on his forehead betrayed him. "I didn't do anything. This kid stole from me." Sanders moved to flank him, one hand near his own holstered weapon. "We'll sort that out," he said in a level voice. "But right now, we need you to step away from everyone and keep your hands where we can see them." Lopez then scanned the diner, looking for cues from the patrons. An older woman in a floral blouse pointed at the man in the suit and blurted, "He grabbed that boy. Threatened him." She sounded both outraged and frightened at once. Caroline chimed in. "He came in here, yelling about money this kid supposedly owed him. It looked like extortion." She was clearly unsettled, but mustered the courage to speak to the officers. "And he tried to push Mr. Jackson away, nearly started a fight." Hearing his name, Samuel offered a brief nod to confirm her words. "I saw him corner the boy," he explained to Officer Lopez, who now stood near him. "There was no sign the kid stole anything. It was intimidation, plain and simple." The boy gulped, finally finding his voice. He's been following me for a couple days. Said I owed him protection money. When I couldn't pay, he threatened me." A ripple of shock coursed through the bystanders. Extortion was not uncommon in big cities, but witnessing it in a family diner still felt jarringly personal. Officer Sanders eyed the man in the suit. "You want to tell us your name?" "Darren," the man hissed reluctantly. "Darren Horvath." Horvath glowered at the boy and then at Samuel, as though blaming them equally for his predicament. Slowly, Sanders guided Horvath away from the others, instructing him to keep his hands visible. Meanwhile, Lopez approached the boy, gently urging him to sit down at a nearby table. "We need your name, too," Lopez said kindly to the teen. "Eric," the boy replied, voice trembling. "Eric Langford." Samuel watched the police separate them, relieved that the immediate danger had ebbed. Still, the diner's air felt thick with unresolved tension, as if the confrontation were only half finished. For a few moments, the only sounds came from the scratch of pens on notepads, the shuffle of shoes on linoleum, and Horvath's heavy breathing. Sanders initiated the formalities of an on-site investigation, questioning Horvath. The man insisted that Eric had stolen something of value, money or a wallet. His story kept shifting. But even from a distance, it was obvious Horvath's narrative kept tripping over its own inconsistencies. In the corner, Caroline quietly told Officer Lopez how Horvath had grabbed Eric's backpack first, and how Samuel stepped in to prevent violence. Eric's story poured out in fits and starts once he realized the officers were there to help, not to punish him. He described how Horvath had hovered near a community center a few blocks away, waiting for unsuspecting teens to walk home. How he'd approached Eric one afternoon, claiming that the streets around the neighborhood were dangerous, and that Eric needed protection. Then came the demands for money. "It started with $20 a week," Eric murmured, still clutching his backpack. "But last night he wanted more, and I didn't have it." Officer Lopez's jaw tightened. "Sounds like textbook intimidation." He nodded grimly. "We'll need you to make a formal statement, Eric." Through all of this, Samuel lingered quietly, prepared to clarify any details. He answered the officer's questions as concisely as he could: how he first noticed the altercation, why he intervened, and how Horvath tried to flee. Each time he spoke, he kept an eye on Eric, who looked as though he was carrying the weight of the world on his small shoulders. Outside, a small knot of curious onlookers had gathered, likely drawn by the flashing lights of the squad cars. A few people peered through the diner's glass windows, phones out, hoping to catch a glimpse of an impromptu Hollywood moment. Not now, Samuel thought, steeling himself against the possibility that the confrontation might become fodder for tabloids or viral social media posts. At last, Sanders slipped a pair of handcuffs from his belt and snapped them around Darren Horvath's wrists. The tension soared again. Horvath let out a snarl of protest, yanking away from the officer. But Sanders was no rookie. With practiced movements, he secured Horvath's arms behind his back, forcing him to comply. A few patrons averted their eyes, unsettled by the raw intensity of the arrest, while others looked relieved that a dangerous man was being taken off the street. "This is bull!" Horvath shouted. "You're taking that kid's word and the word of some actor?" Lopez kept his expression neutral. "We'll gather all statements. You'll have your chance to talk at the station." His tone was clipped. He'd clearly heard variations of this defensive rant 100 times over. With Horvath restrained, the officers nodded to each other. Sanders guided him toward the exit, announcing they would escort him to the precinct for booking and questioning. As the man was led out in handcuffs, a hush fell over the diner once more. The confrontation that began so explosively had ended in a swift, definitive manner. Yet the emotional echoes remained palpable. Eric slumped into a booth, tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. I'm sorry," he said, voice quivering with relief and embarrassment. "I didn't mean to cause a scene." Samuel moved to stand beside him, resting a reassuring hand on the teen's shoulder. "You didn't cause anything, Eric. You're the victim here." Officer Lopez gestured for Caroline, Eric, and Samuel to gather by the counter. "We'll need short written statements from each of you," he said gently. "We appreciate your cooperation." Caroline immediately grabbed a pad of paper from the cash register area. Eric rubbed his eyes, nodded, and scribbled down his account of events as best he could. Meanwhile, the older woman in the floral blouse wandered over too, offering to be another witness. She seemed relieved to help in any way possible. Through it all, Samuel answered the officer's questions patiently. In the back of his mind, he thought about how drastically his day had changed. He had only wanted a quiet brunch and a chance to relax, but fate had placed him at the center of a moral crossroad, and, for that matter, a legal one. Once the statements were gathered, Sanders re-entered the diner. "We're transporting Horvath to the station now. Mr. Jackson, we might need you to come by the precinct for a follow-up." He gave a small, polite nod, and there was the faintest flicker of a smile, perhaps the officer's way of saying thank you. Eric gingerly rose to his feet. "The police said my aunt is on her way," he said, voice still quiet. He clutched his backpack once more, though his grip wasn't as desperate as before. "I'll stick around until she gets here," Samuel replied kindly. He was aware that the swirl of post-confrontation adrenaline might leave Eric feeling lost. Outside, onlookers parted as the squad car pulled away, Horvath's shouts muffled behind closed doors. Another police vehicle lingered, waiting for final confirmations before departing. Slowly, the life of Gracie's diner restarted. Conversations resumed in tentative whispers, as though everyone was replaying the events in their minds. A few patrons drifted back to their booths. The cook, who had ducked behind the pass-through during the commotion, turned the grill on again, and the hiss of bacon and eggs brought a semblance of normalcy. Caroline offered fresh coffee to those who needed it, her hands still trembling slightly. Meanwhile, Samuel and Eric sat together in one of the corner booths, sharing a fragile calm. What had begun as an ordinary morning meal for one, and an ordinary day of trying to stay safe for the other, had transformed into a stark confrontation that would bind their paths together. Neither fully realized it yet, but this moment was far more than just an interruption. It was the start of a chain of events that would force them both to confront hidden truths about the city, about justice, and about the power of a single act of compassion. The late morning sun was climbing higher in the sky by the time the police had fully secured the scene at Gracie's diner. The scents of sizzling bacon and fresh coffee tried to reassert themselves over the tense atmosphere, but the aftermath of Darren Horvath's arrest still lingered among the patrons. Inside the diner, Detective Javier Flores appeared, an older man with a meticulous demeanor, wearing a plain gray suit that contrasted sharply with the standard LAPD uniforms. He had arrived just moments after Officer Lopez and Officer Sanders finished taking statements. While the younger officers stepped aside to speak with witnesses again, Flores quietly absorbed the details from Caroline, the waitress, and from the older woman in the floral blouse who had seen the entire confrontation. Samuel was seated at a corner booth next to Eric, the teenage boy Horvath had been harassing for protection money. The boy seemed exhausted, as though a massive weight had fallen on him and refused to lift. He drummed his fingers anxiously on his backpack, which rested on the table in front of him, still refusing to leave it out of his sight. Looking around, Samuel noticed how the patrons had begun to settle back into a semblance of normalcy. Some half-heartedly returned to their pancakes, others asked Caroline for to-go boxes. Yet the hush of discomfort remained. The day's events felt too raw, too real, to be shaken off by a second cup of coffee. Detective Flores approached their booth, his sharp gaze taking in Samuel's composed posture, then shifting to Eric's drawn face. He nodded respectfully to them both. "Mr. Jackson," Flores said, addressing Samuel with the mild courtesy of a man who'd seen 100 strange scenes in his career. "I'd like to thank you for stepping in. We've been watching that man, Darren Horvath, for a while. Not many people are willing to intervene when they see a teenager getting harassed. I'm sure it made a difference for Eric." Eric inhaled sharply, as if he meant to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. The mention of Horvath's name brought back the memory of the man's snarling face, the oppressive intimidation that had dogged him for weeks. Nonetheless, he managed a weak nod in acknowledgement. Samuel glanced at Eric, then turned back to Flores. "I just did what anyone else should have done," he said simply. "I couldn't sit there and let him get bullied. Especially by an adult." Flores rubbed his chin, his expression thoughtful. "From what I gather, this wasn't just random bullying. Horvath's a known enforcer. We suspect he's part of a small network that extorts money from kids around this area. They call it protection, but it's anything but." Eric blanched, his knuckles whitening around the edge of his backpack. He muttered something beneath his breath, barely audible. "Perhaps I knew it, or that's what he told me." Either way, it was clear this knowledge both confirmed his fears and unsettled him further. Detective Flores cleared his throat, then addressed Eric directly. "Son, we appreciate your cooperation. We'll need a formal statement from you at the station. It'll help us build a case, so this guy doesn't get back on the streets." Eric tried to look confident but only partially succeeded. I'll do it. He threatened to find me if I told anyone, but I guess he already knows where I live." Flores nodded. "We'll do what we can to keep you safe." Then, he shifted his attention back to Samuel. "You too, Mr. Jackson. We might need your testimony. Are you willing to come down to the precinct to solidify your statement?" Samuel gave a small smile, the kind that reached only halfway to his eyes. "Absolutely. I'll help however I can." Flores made a note in his small notepad. "Thanks. The more evidence we have, the stronger the case. Horvath's been slipping through our fingers for months, mostly because he preys on kids who are afraid to talk." A spasm of anger flashed through Samuel's chest at that. He'd grown up in neighborhoods where fear was a currency. He knew what it was like for young people to be intimidated by adults who had no qualms about bending them to their will. The thought spurred him to lean a little closer, his voice quiet yet intense. "This extortion ring, how big is it?" Flores shrugged, a tired expression crossing his face. "We're not entirely sure. Could be a few guys, could be a mid-level operation. Horvath is one piece of the puzzle. This area's seen a rise in petty crime, especially targeting young teens. You step in to save one kid, and you end up uncovering a dozen more stories." An uneasy silence settled over the table, prompting Caroline to step over and refill Samuel's coffee mug. She offered Eric an orange juice on the house, which he accepted with a wobbly smile of gratitude. The kindness of strangers felt both comforting and surreal to him, as if he still hadn't processed that he was no longer alone in the fight against Horvath. Do you think they'll come after me?" Eric asked, directing the question to the detective but glancing sideways at Samuel, as though seeking reassurance from both of them. Flores sighed, choosing his words carefully. "I won't lie to you, Eric. These guys can be persistent. But once they're behind bars, it's a lot harder for them to do anything. And we intend to keep pursuing the whole operation until we shut it down for good." Officer Lopez approached, gesturing for Flores's attention. "We've got Horvath in the cruiser. Want us to transport him now?" Flores nodded and waved him off. Yeah, book him. Keep him separate from the general holding area. He's likely to brag, or worse. I'll be down later for the questioning. As Lopez left, leading Horvath out through the diner's door, Detective Flores turned back to Eric and Samuel. All right, I'll give you two some privacy for a minute. Eric, your aunt's on her way, right? Eric nodded. That's what the officer said. Good. We'll escort you both to the station once she's here, so you can file your statements. In the meantime, if you need anything, I'm around. With that, Flores gave them a curt, reassuring nod and moved off to speak with some of the other patrons. A weary hush descended, broken only by the soft clink of dishes as Caroline went about her duties. The older woman in the floral blouse was still present, giving a statement to one of the remaining officers. The cook at the grill started plating fresh orders, trying to bring life back into a space that had been tainted by the morning's confrontation. Samuel took a slow sip of coffee, then set the mug down. Eric, he said, voice gentle but serious, I'm not gonna pry into your life. But if there's anything else you want to tell me, or if you need help, I'm all ears. The teen exhaled, tapping a rhythmic pattern on his backpack. I didn't know what to do, he said, eyes downcast. He approached me a few weeks ago, said I was walking through gang territory, fake stuff, probably, but I didn't know. He told me I should pay him, or else get jumped by the real gang members. I was scared. Of course you were, Samuel replied, forcing his tone to stay even. Inside, anger churned at the thought of a grown man menacing a kid like this. It's not your fault. I've seen stuff like that before, back where I grew up. Eric sniffled, suddenly looking younger than his 14 or 15 years. I couldn't tell my aunt. She's working 2 jobs, barely has time to think. And I thought if I didn't say anything, it would stop. It just got worse. A flash of empathy tightened Samuel's chest. He pictured how lonely that must have felt for the kid, carrying the secret of this extortion around day after day. I'm sorry you had to deal with that alone, he said. But you did the right thing by speaking up now. At that moment, the diner's door swung open again, this time admitting a middle-aged woman with frazzled hair and tired eyes, Eric's aunt, presumably. She wore a dark green sweater and clutched a purse so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. The instant she spotted Eric, she rushed to his side, voice trembling with concern. Oh my God! Eric, are you okay? He stood, letting go of his backpack just long enough to offer a shaky hug. I'm okay, he said, though his voice wavered. This guy tried to. She shushed him, glancing at Samuel with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. I heard everything. Thank you, she told Samuel, her eyes welling with tears she was too weary to suppress. Samuel shook his head, signaling that she owed him no thanks. I'm just glad I was here, he replied softly. Then he introduced himself more formally, though she obviously knew who he was. She reached out, squeezed his hand, and repeated her gratitude. Detective Flores reappeared to meet Eric's aunt, explaining the next steps for filing a report, offering them a place to sit. Meanwhile, another officer gathered the last of the witness statements. The diner, while still operational, felt more like a stage set for a somber drama than a cozy morning spot. In a sense, though, the intervention had only begun. As much as Horvath had been apprehended, Flores had hinted at a larger network of intimidating thugs and enforcers, a malignant presence in the neighborhood that thrived on fear and silence. Samuel sensed that Eric and his aunt had just stepped out of the frying pan, not necessarily out of the fire. But with the police moving in, and with the support of a celebrity willing to put the weight of his name behind the cause, perhaps this time the operation's days were numbered. For now, the best they could do was head to the station, give their statements, and ensure Eric knew he was not alone. A quiet sense of determination began to settle in Samuel's heart. This wasn't just about one diner confrontation. It was about stopping a cycle of fear that no kid should ever have to endure. The day after Darren Horvath's arrest felt strangely quiet for Samuel L. Jackson. He woke early, despite having no morning commitments on his schedule. The restless energy of the past 24 hours lingered in his mind, refusing to let him fully relax. Ever since he had intervened at Gracie's diner to protect Eric, his thoughts had been stuck in a loop, reliving the look of fear in the teenager's eyes and the raw anger in Horvath's. At first, Samuel tried to brush it off. I did what anyone else should have done. But as he stood in his kitchen, brewing a pot of coffee and flipping absently through the morning headlines, he realized the incident had reignited some deeply buried memories. Memories of growing up on the rougher edges of Chattanooga, seeing small-time hustlers shake down kids for lunch money or protection near the basketball courts. Sometimes the methods were subtle, a veiled threat here, an intimidating stare there. Other times, it was as blatant as what happened to Eric. He could almost see his younger self, wide-eyed and nervous, hoping each day that he wouldn't be the one singled out for an extortion scheme. He recalled the day an older neighbor had stepped in to help him, an action that changed the trajectory of his teenage years. Now, decades later, he found himself stepping into that same role for Eric, and the parallel weighed on him. Sighing, Samuel poured his coffee into a thermos, pulled on a light jacket, and headed for his car. He might not have a scheduled interview or a film shoot, but he felt compelled to do something. The sense of responsibility gnawed at him. Eric was safe for the moment, but for how long? The police could only do so much if the network behind Horvath went deeper. As he eased onto the streets of Los Angeles, the early sun glinted off the hood of his SUV. He turned on the radio, half listening to a broadcast about local crime rates, half lost in thought. The newscaster cited an uptick in petty gang activity near youth centers. It was all too relevant to Eric's plight. When he arrived at the LAPD's Hollywood division to follow up on his statement, the atmosphere felt charged with the typical bustle of a metropolitan police station, phones ringing, officers conferring in low voices, the occasional clang of a cell door echoing through the corridors. Detective Javier Flores, who had been at the diner the previous day, spotted Samuel almost immediately. "Mr. Jackson," Flores called, beckoning him over to a desk cluttered with files. "Glad you came in. I was about to call you." "Please call me Samuel," he replied, stepping past a couple of uniformed officers. "Any updates on Horvath?" Flores leaned back in his chair. "He's in holding. Tried to stonewall us at first, but eventually blurted out a few names we're looking into. Nothing concrete yet, but it's a start. We'll keep him there as long as we can, pending arraignment. The DA wants to see if we can tie him to other incidents." Samuel's gaze flicked to a board on the wall, photographs of individuals connected to various local crimes. "I just hope Eric's safe," he said quietly. "And the other kids, too." Flores followed Samuel's line of sight. "That's the big worry. If Horvath is part of a bigger ring, they might retaliate against anyone who speaks up. We have an officer keeping an eye on Eric's neighborhood, just in case." The mention of retaliation made Samuel's chest tighten. He knew how quickly violent networks could lash out when cornered. "Let me know if there's anything I can do," he said. "I'm not a cop, but if my name can help bring attention to this, whatever it takes." Flores nodded, though his eyes carried the caution of a seasoned officer. "Be careful, Mr. Jackson. Sometimes attention is exactly what these groups exploit. They either try to discredit the witness or escalate the threats. Just keep your guard up." Samuel sighed, recognizing the reality of the situation. Even so, he couldn't stand idly by. "I appreciate the warning." After signing a few documents to clarify his statement, Samuel left the station feeling both determined and uneasy. Outside, a small group of reporters loitered near the steps, one of them with a camera crew. News of Horvath's arrest, and Samuel's role in it, had trickled out. Flashes and questions bombarded him as soon as he stepped into view. "Is it true you confronted a gang enforcer, Mr. Jackson? Are you pressing charges?" He kept his responses brief, offering only that the police were handling the investigation. While he understood the media's interest, he didn't want to turn a teenager's trauma into a sensational headline. The best course was to let law enforcement do their job without making Eric more of a target. Once clear of the reporters, Samuel drove toward the community center near Eric's neighborhood. The incident had spurred him to learn more about the place, which, according to Detective Flores, was a hot spot for kids who had nowhere else to go after school. He had a memory from the diner, Eric mentioning he spent afternoons shooting hoops there. Maybe the staff knew something about Horvath, or others like him. The building was a modest concrete structure, its walls brightened by a colorful mural depicting children playing sports and musical instruments. A chain-link fence surrounded a small basketball court at the side. The squeak of sneakers on asphalt echoed through the air, though only a few kids were present. Inside, the lobby smelled of disinfectant and old carpet. Posters advertised free tutoring sessions, job fairs, and youth outreach programs. A lean, middle-aged woman behind the reception desk looked up, surprise flickering across her features as she recognized the celebrity standing before her. "Hi," Samuel said gently, doing his best to project calm. "I'm looking for the director." "Is that you?" The woman blinked, then composed herself. "No, that's Mr. Henderson. Let me see if he's available." She picked up a phone, speaking in low tones. A few minutes later, James Henderson emerged, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a crisp button-down shirt, though the casual scuff marks on his shoes suggested he spent a lot of time on his feet. "Mr. Jackson," Henderson greeted, offering a firm handshake. "This is unexpected. Can I help you with something?" Samuel nodded. "I'm here about Eric Langford. He's a kid who comes around here, right?" At the mention of Eric's name, Henderson's expression shifted to one of concern. "Yes, Eric's been here on and off. He's a quiet kid, but I know he's had some trouble recently. I was there when he was harassed by a man named Horvath. The police are involved now, but—" Samuel paused, choosing his words carefully. "I just wanted to see if there's anything I can do, or if there are more kids dealing with the same problem." Henderson let out a heavy breath, motioning for Samuel to follow him into a small office lined with books and trophies from past youth tournaments. "I wish I could say Eric's case is unusual, but it's not. We've had a few older teens mention being approached by adults offering protection. I don't have names, but rumors float around." Inside the office, Henderson closed the door for privacy. "A lot of these kids, like Eric, come from struggling households. They're latchkey kids, or their parents are working multiple jobs. Some have been in foster care. They're vulnerable, and men like Horvath know exactly how to exploit that." Samuel settled into a plastic chair, an unsettling déjà vu creeping over him. This was all too reminiscent of the neighborhoods where he'd spent his own formative years. "Have you reported anything to the police?" he asked, leaning forward, forearms on his thighs. "I have. But without concrete evidence or a direct witness, it's hard for them to act. Most teens are too scared to speak up, and by the time they do, it's often too late." Henderson's tone carried the weight of long-standing frustration. "We do our best. We run workshops on how to stay safe, encourage them to buddy up. But it's a constant battle." Samuel chewed the inside of his cheek, thinking of Eric's terrified expression. "I'd like to help," he said at last, voice resolute. "Whether that means sponsoring self-defense classes, or starting a scholarship program, something to let these kids know they're not alone." Henderson nodded, his eyes lighting up with a mix of relief and determination. "They'd listen to you."